John Helliwell, welcome to this conversation around happiness and well-being. What a time to be alive, right? And what a time to talk about society and happiness. And what a time to probably have, to me, top economists that really know what's going on. So I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation. We are so willing to learn from you what's going on and what's going to happen. So welcome, John. It's always a pleasure being with you. And I see your background is in nature. So first of all, how are you? And can we start with the question, what's really going on in the world with society and economy?
Nothing like starting with a simple question. We're living in a situation that has had no ready parallel in more than a century. And a century ago, with the flu of 1918, we were not connected the way we are now by travel, by internet, by anything. So that although it was a global pandemic then, it was global in a very different way. Today, we are all connected and seeing each other's misery day by day, seeing each other's happiness day by day, seeing the evidence of people connecting and helping each other in ways we didn't imagine, neighbors reconnecting with neighbors, reaching out to help one another. At the same time, it puts pressure on fractures that were already there. So the experience, you could imagine, as a happiness expert, one of the things we first started doing is to say, are the happier countries doing better under this kind of situation or worse? Are they maintaining their happiness? What is it that governs a country's success? Because we do measure the data on the prevalence and consequences of COVID by country. And they form an interesting mix so that if you take and of course, every country has been hit at a different time than other countries. So when you're comparing countries, you have to look at ones that are similarly exposed and open and have had to deal with the pandemic at roughly the same time. But if you sort of divide the countries into groups, among the countries that are sort of the Western industrial democracies, if you line them up in terms of their previous happiness, those that were the happiest countries are the ones that are doing best under the pandemic on epidemiological criteria, in other words, death per capita. And when we look deeper into it, we find, because there are a number of surveys going on during this period, and we're linked up with some of them, a particular one from Imperial College in YouGov in the UK runs across 28 countries. And we're seeing that people are happier living in countries where they have trust in their health authorities and are willing to act in the way that the health authorities ask. And of course, those are also the same countries typically where they have health authorities who are making good decisions and where they are moving more quickly and in a more balanced way. So, for example, the countries that have done best in that group are very happy countries like Iceland and Norway and New Zealand. They're all typically very happy countries. They all moved with a lot of public support quickly, and they have been able essentially to create COVID-free bubbles, in New Zealand case, almost completely so, and close to it in the others. So they've managed to avoid what other people have said is an inevitable contradiction and conflict between the economy and grandmother's health. And you have to give up on the health side in order to get the economy going again. those countries have shown that that's wrong, that in fact, if you handle the health problems correctly, you actually do end up getting back to hugs and jobs and more quickly than you would otherwise, and being happier in the process. There's another group of countries that have been very successful in medically dealing with COVID, and it's a whole series of countries in East Asia. And they have a variety of political systems. They clearly have all, maybe because they've been close enough to see the experience and see the requirement for moving quickly, testing widely, and then making sure. I mean, we had a meeting of a few weeks ago that was supposed to have happened at the Vatican on the end of March, but of course it didn't. So it was held in middle of May, and the evidence we were getting, we had one expert coming in from Hong Kong, and he was explaining that they had just had a second outbreak in Wuhan, which of course had been the epicenter in the first case. And he said, in order to deal with that second outbreak, they tested 10 million people in 10 days. In Wuhan, which is essentially the whole population of Wuhan. So they immediately acted on the scale required in order to make sure there wasn't a second outbreak. And so they were able to shut it down. And that's an extreme case, but of course they pushed the science now. They can do tests where you can pool a whole lot of samples because you're not expecting many positives, and you can do the science much more quickly that way. So that's a separate group of countries that are not traditionally very happy countries, but have nonetheless been effective. And then the rest of the world is we don't have as much detail on, in part because they're only now coming into the serious parts of the crisis, many of them, and we don't have any data yet on how they're psychologically, how they're dealing with it. Does that give you something to start on?
Oh, that definitely yes, John. We know from your books and your reports and the World Happiness reports that social connections, physical health, income, and employment are key pillars of happiness. And the COVID has really impacted on all those four. Can you explain a bit further what these pillars are, and how do you see these societies, not just the happy or the happier ones, but actually those who are not that happy, how we are going to be moving towards a new reality where happiness and well-being can be at the core, when we know that this situation is really impacting those core pillars of happiness? Can we expand and can we go deeper into those?
Yes, you're right. It's important to recognize the damage that has been done to the traditional pillars. I mean, obviously, physical health is the most extreme one, and it's hit twice because the health systems have had to be twisted around to focus on COVID. As a consequence, they have had less resources, less time, and less possibilities for dealing with all other health problems. So increasingly, countries are starting not now just to look at deaths from COVID, but to look at excess deaths in total. What about all the people who are not having their other health conditions looked at? So there's a double hit to health. Employment, of course, the levels of unemployment are higher than they have been in almost a century in many countries. And social connections, of course, that's another extreme one, because, of course, as you know, we've written papers looking at the happiness effects of online friends compared to real friends. I mean, real-time connection friends. And we found that the bigger your circle of real-time friends, the happier you were, but the size of your online network had no impact at all on your happiness. Well, that was then, and this is now. What's happened is, you'll remember there was a special chapter in the World Happiness Report where we looked at the effect of social networks, social media, on happiness. And we found Jean Twenge from California had a lot of evidence that, especially for younger people, especially for adolescent females, there were very corrosive effects from the use of social media, and there was almost no evidence of good effects. Well, what COVID has done is pull apart the physical networks. And as you know, when we launched the World Happiness Report, we said, people have been talking about social distancing as something you need to do to protect against it. We said, no, that's absolutely wrong. That's the wrong way to think about it. It's physical distancing that protects your health. You want to get social closeness while keeping physical distance. Well, when you think about it, then you say, well, that's what the social media ought to be good at establishing social connections, like the conversation we're having right now, even when we can't be in the same room or even in the same country as the situation is now. And it's quite remarkable, we're finding, the extent to which people not only have used social media to substitute for the real-time connections with friends, but they've moved further. And so I'm sure it is true for you as it is for me. I've had people reaching out to me from all over the world, friends I haven't seen in years, who are saying, how are you? And making connections in a way which is very heartwarming. In the normal course of events, they wouldn't have thought of using the social media in this way, and they wouldn't thought of reaching out. And especially among people of my generation whose offspring are spread in many countries and many places, they often find, even pre-COVID, they weren't hearing from their family very frequently. Many such people are now hearing more frequently than they did before. And so I described it as saying that social media are at last becoming social media, because there was a sense in which they were being antisocial in their consequences. What we have a right to expect, or hope to expect, is that that is a lesson that has been learned, and so that people will continue to use distance communication as a way of course, it's already reorganizing work life. So the new employment situation will be a different employment situation. I think you asked me to go through the pillars. Now, I've been through health and the economy and the social connections. There's a fourth pillar that you didn't mention explicitly, but which is critically important here, and that's mutual trust and support. So it's having a social identity. It's not just this close-in social context. It's the feeling that we're all in this together. That has not been damaged by COVID. In fact, that sense of trust and connection is enormously important everywhere. You'll remember in several previous World Happiness Reports, we emphasized that that level of trust was critically important in dealing with natural disasters of many kinds, from earthquakes to floods, tsunamis, nuclear disasters. high trust neighborhoods and high trust countries, you find that people immediately rush out to help each other. And in the end, they feel much better for doing that. And it's in part because people's instinct to rush out and help other people and their instinct to trust other people is much higher than they think it is. So then they're pleasantly surprised to find out how generous their neighbors are, how much they gain by working together. So any disaster gives the possibility of demonstrating that level of trust, and COVID has done it in spades because it's a disaster, if you like, that's affected all aspects of life. And that's another reason why the happiest countries, which are traditionally, one of the reasons they're happy is that they're high trust societies. And it is that high trust that's one of the biggest defenses. And you can see how if the initial trust levels are low enough, then you tend to find people blaming one another or blaming somebody else. And we've seen it in many countries where you get sometimes it's government and people, sometimes it's health authorities and people, sometimes it's country against country, essentially blaming someone else rather than working together to develop a solution. So it isn't as though everybody can find the happy solution to this very difficult set of circumstances. The levels of trust that allow you to put up with what's happening and to build a better and happier future, it's a very special resource that has to be treated very carefully. So every individual and every community has to resist the urge to find a villain, to find another, to find somebody else to blame. And it's the fact that because COVID strikes people who are close together, so that people who can't establish physical distance easily are those most at risk. Well, you could imagine where that's been worst. So if we're looking at the damage that's been done to these pillars you spoke of, the damage is worst for those who are in institutional settings. Elder care has been a critically important one. Prisons are another. The homeless, people in housing where many people are put together, sometimes foreign work camps, agricultural camps, meat clacking plants, you name it, where people are together. And those are often people who are already disadvantaged. So you find in the United States, for example, that the proportion of infected blacks is much higher than whites. And essentially the reason is that they are more likely to be living in prisons, in housing that doesn't give room and options to have employment or to require employment, because having no savings and often not being so connected to the overall welfare system. And that situation is worst in the countries that already had the most inequality. So those issues are much less likely to have arisen in the high trust, more equal societies like the ones we spoke of in the Nordic countries in New Zealand, where basically everyone has similar levels of housing and ability to access the public services. So you don't get these same discrepancies. So that's an extra push. And in those countries where inequality has, and we find it has been, that in fact the inequality of well-being has grown during COVID. And it happens most obviously in the countries that were already more unequal and that had lower levels of trust. So we're getting some of this evidence that what we previously knew to be important is still very important. And that means looking ahead that countries where trust has been put under pressure and not been adequate, then the primary effort required on the part of all of us, starting with the family and the neighborhood and the city and the country and then the international community, is to remind ourselves of the golden rule, remind ourselves that true happiness is built on assuring the happiness of others and of forging and reforging the trust linkages that make that connection natural and makes our common purpose a happy one.
Profound answer, and I love the analysis. And when you mentioned about inequality, the more I go deeper as well into the key drivers of happiness and well-being around the world, inequality looks like one of those elements that if we don't fix and we don't solve, it's going to be very difficult to get to 10 billion happier people by 2050, for example. I'm reading one of your articles on NBC News where you mentioned this study from NORC at the University of Chicago that says that basically today adults, only 40% are very happy. The drop goes from 31% just 2 years ago. So if we combine the trend of despair in some places with one key driver of inequality or equality and the economic system we are living in, is this the moment to blame? I don't like blaming anybody, by the way, but is this the moment to blame the system? Is this the moment to rethink the economic systems that we have in place? Is this a systemic issue we are living now? How would you deal with the system itself?
Well, because the international press is dominated by news out of the United States, especially the English language media, there is more emphasis on inequality in the effects of COVID and on inequality more generally than, and it's legitimate that that should be happening in the United States, which has grown. And Mexico has also been in a similar situation of a rapidly growing trend of inequality over the last decades and high levels of inequality, almost uniquely high among the industrial countries. But there have not been such trends in the majority of the industrial countries. And so the inequality was not as great, and it has not been put in as much pressure by COVID-19. So I think we find that these general things we know improve well-being. In some sense, people who are worried most, as we all are in a way, about the happiness or unhappiness of those who are worst off, there is some tendency to focus on those who are worst off and look for specific remedies to them. Well, as you know, the work of Bo Rothstein in Sweden and others has said, the more you have a system that treats everybody equally and supports everybody equally, rather than treating them as disadvantaged and advantaged group and taking from the advantaged and give to the disadvantaged, that tends to breed a continuing idea that we're living in a world where I can only have more if you have less. The point about happiness in general is that you don't take happiness from somebody and give it to somebody else. You build it together for both. And that's true of social connections generally. It's true of the workplace. It should be true everywhere. So a lot of the focus on inequality, both analyzing it in terms of income and dealing with it in terms of redistributing income, tends to build in an adversarial system where it's the us and to them, and them can only be, you can see this conflict appearing in many countries. The beauty of emphasizing happiness as the target of human activity is that it immediately invites you to think of ways of building a better society and a better life by a variety of methods that are essentially win-win from the beginning. We're not taking from somebody in order to help somebody else. We're working together to make lives better for all. One of the most striking results in the most recent World Happiness Report, most striking to me when we found it, because we then went back and looked for more evidence and pounded the data harder, is we found that trust is important for everybody. Two kinds of trust. Trust in other people generally, whether they'd return your wallet if you dropped it in the street, that kind of trust, and trust in public authorities and institutions. Are those institutions honest? Are they efficient? Are they working in our common interest? And where those levels of trust are high, everybody's happier. But the people who gain most in happiness are those who are already worst off. And so the unemployed, the people subject to discrimination, the people who are in ill health, the people with low incomes, they're the ones who gain most from living in a higher trust society. And you can see many reasons why that might be. And empirically, it's true that so the damage, all four of those things, of course, damage your happiness. And we're trying to get rid of them, obviously, around the world. But the point is, if together we build a trust and warm connections, in fact, that already reduces the inequality of happiness, which is the real inequality that matters. It's not about income, it's about happiness. We're just trying to pull people who are in despair out of despair, but it's not us giving them our happiness, it's us helping them to find opportunities to work together for more happiness. But having a high trust environment automatically reduces inequality in those important respects. And that's a result that was important before COVID, and it's even more important now.
So the title that we gave to this conversation is, are we ready for a society of happiness and well-being? Can we call it actually, are we ready for happitalism? Are we ready for new isms? Although we actually, or we should manage what we have now. Can we go beyond GDP? GDP is always associated with capitalism, but we know from Bhutan as well. Actually, in Bhutan, they don't have one single death so far. They have 85 cases of COVID, but nobody has died yet in Bhutan. Can we talk? Can we answer, I mean, how can we explore answering the question of, are we ready for these type of societies? Are we ready for new isms? Are we ready for capitalism? Are we ready? Do we actually need a new system? Or we could actually manage with the systems that we have?
The systems we have been developed without a lot of tending over the last 50 years. So in many countries, there's been a gradual erosion of the social contract, of the ability of people to feel that they were part of a larger society and larger community. And so people have built their own and have found themselves with their own media streams, their own networks that were more separated than they were before. And people have been thinking, and a lot of the public discussion of success under capitalism was coming to be focused on income and wealth and the desirability of material progress. and as evidenced by consumption, physical consumption. So people were becoming, they were encouraged through advertisements and a variety of other things. It wasn't explicitly a target of most public policies, but it was the framework of social pressures and information pressures that we were all subject to. The idea of that SUV sitting on top of a mountaintop or a helicopter to a fancy resort was thought of as, if not something we could aspire to, something we could admire somebody else aspiring to, and we ourselves might get a bigger barbecue. Well, this increasing focus on material things, we already have known for decades in happiness research is a bad idea, that people routinely overestimate the life satisfaction they get from material things. They underestimate the life satisfaction they'll get from social connections and friendships and time with each other. COVID-19 has pulled people out of that material world, and it has forced them to rethink life. And that's one of the advantages of this, is that people have been drawn out of the normal, what they thought of as the normal capitalist system with the normal employment and the normal consumption patterns and so on. In one piece I wrote early in the pandemic, I said, don't think of this as a recession. Think of this as a timeout for the commercial economy. And if you want to know how much consumption has dropped in terms of the things we really require and consume, don't look at the GDP accounts, because they were only measuring what was going on in the market. Well, of course, the market stopped. The airplanes stopped. The resorts stopped. The fitness clubs stopped. The restaurants stopped. The plays stopped. The movies stopped. The football matches stopped. All of these very large commercial ventures, a big part of the commercial economy, now stopped. People didn't stop being entertained. They didn't stop entertaining. They didn't stop eating. They stopped going to restaurants. And so people, there was a huge move back. Over the last 50 years, there's been a huge, GDP has grown very fast relative to real well-being. And one of the reasons why many of the things we used to do with each other, for each other, outside the market, became in the market, whether it's looking after children, whether it's eating, whether it's entertainment. And all at once, in a week, that commercial economy was put on the sidelines, and people rediscovered what it was like to do things themselves. And so people were cutting their own hair and making their own jokes and entertaining. They were discovering who in the family could sing and who couldn't sing. Now, I know your audience includes a lot of people in Latin America, and Latin Americans have known this and lived it much more fully than people elsewhere in the world, that the real happiness of social connections is what you do with each other, for each other, in a very small scale. And so the extended family is a much more normal thing in Latin America than elsewhere. And of course, it's already made. There's a lot more doing naturally for each other and with each other in an extended family environment. Other people are being driven back into their family pods and are rediscovering. So the actual quality of life is measured by the entertainment people are actually having, the jokes they're having, the pleasures they're having, has not fallen as much as you might think, to say there are no holidays, there are no football matches, there are no restaurant meals. He said, well, actually, that meal, that bread I cooked at home turned out to be better than the bread I was buying anyway. So you're finding people around the world are now thinking somewhat differently about these things. And they're saying, I'm not I'm not sure I want to go back to work all the time in that office downtown. People who are now making big decisions for major employment structures are saying, you know, we as employers really wouldn't, we would benefit from having a smaller office if we could keep all things going, or a smaller factory and more distribution of production if we could keep it going effectively. You're now finding many people saying, well, you know, I didn't really want to spend an hour and a half commuting every day, and I'm enjoying working at home. And a number of employers have gone to their staff now and said, well, how about this? Have you enjoyed working at home? Which, of course, a lot of people are doing. I mean, we have to remember there are lots of people who don't have these attractive choices. But for those who do have these choices, many of them are probably having experienced something they never thought they would experience. They're finding out there's a lot to like about it. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if you found the norm for jobs, because what's been happening in jobs over the last 50 years is that the same internet that's facilitated social media has also facilitated very widespread commercial activities. It's now just as possible for us to have this meeting across the world as it is to have a board meeting across the world, or getting your design team sitting down and designing a new airframe. And so what was once send the programs to Delhi to work on overnight while you slept in California, that's now absolutely normal and being done everywhere. So there's a distribution around the world of activities, and it's changing the way, so it's making networks broader, and it's probably going to leave us to a situation where we'll never return to this. The city itself is being changed here, right? Because it isn't just people not wanting to commute so much within a city, they're not so likely to want to commute to a city, either long distance or for their lives. So you're going to find people saying, well, if I can work from home, why should my home be in a high rise in the middle of Mexico City when I could be somewhere where my family would much rather live and we could have a much quieter time and more fun in the streets? So you'll find my guess is this will be a rethinking of cities. It'll certainly be a rethinking of holidays and cruise ships and a whole range of other things. And that'll cause hardships for people who've been in one way of doing things and are going to have to learn a new one. But history provides many examples of people having to change the way they do things because of the force of events. The important thing is to design the new ways to make people happy. You asked me, are we ready for a society of happiness? I said, of course we are. We need it more than ever. The principles, what we have learned, are now saying, don't go back and do things the way you were doing them before. Learn, accept what you've been learning that's good about the life that you're now living, and saying, well, let's construct a future life that allows us to cooperate at longer distances, to meet under different and happier circumstances, so that even when full connections can be reestablished, and we don't know when that will be, that you'll likely to find people who, instead of going to the office 5 days a week and not going to the office 2 days a week, are going to find themselves maybe going to the office 2 days a week and working other places and playing for 5 days a week. And that I can quite imagine for many occupations, that will be better. The principles that have to be brought into play to make this happen are the principles of happiness. like to call it not economics, but eudaimonics, which is the science of happiness, and of which conventional economic activities are a part. It isn't that we've gone beyond GDP, it's just we're now able to realize that GDP is not the way of measuring human progress. It's the things we actually trade with one another and market are part of what we do together, and the food that we produce is important for our lives, and we rely on the things we make. So we don't dismiss it, but the point is we put it in place as an instrument for supporting our better lives. And so we will make it differently, we will use it differently. And if you give me a moment, I'll get back to you and ask the next question, but I want you to come back and ask me before we're finished, what are the implications of this for the environment? Because there are important ones.
We can go deeper in the environment. Let's go, because we know how critical it is that we live with nature, and actually we don't use nature thinking that we own it. So what are the implications with the environment? This is a critical question, please.
I had an insight into that. I mean, we've all had guesses about how this links up with global warming and global environmental questions. We had a chapter in the World Happiness Report this year, and we had the whole focus of the report was the environments for happiness, and especially social environments, of which we've talked quite a bit already, but also physical environments, that for people to live in or near green spaces, to people to live in clean air is not only healthier, but happier. And so both the local environment and the broader environment are very important. And as you know, they're finding already that the COVID fatalities are worse in those areas with bad air quality. So that the ability to see from one side of Delhi to the other, which has been discovered anew for many people who've lived there their whole lives, it not only is pleasant to live in, it's much healthier to live in. And so that in itself has energized many in the environmental movement. They said, see, we can claw back. We don't have to have cities as dirty as we have them, air as dirty as it is, waterways as polluted as they are. And then the second aspect of it is, what about our material demands on the fragile planet? And so there, the question we've already been talking about, which is how important are material things that require planetary resources to our happiness? And the answer is, we're finding not nearly as important as we thought they were. So in fact, an economy based on eudaimonics, on happiness, is in fact one that requires many fewer material resources. So you put all those things together, they're starting to look like a package that would help the world environmental movement, that people are now more aware than they were about the importance of green spaces, the importance of clean air and clean water, and the ability to live happily a less material existence. Now, the overall possibilities for the environment are even better than that, I think. And I came to see that when I was asked to give some closing remarks in a 24-hour webinar that was run on Earth Day by the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. So I sat in on the meetings in 4 continents of local people who were working on, sometimes local projects, an African plantation, a restoration of the Amazon in Latin America, and rooftop gardens in Brooklyn. people doing all kinds of things. What I saw, and it was emphasized in part by a roundtable at the end of university presidents in the United States, where all of them had clearly redesigned what it was to be a university and how a university and its people could contribute to the world. They were all connecting with their local communities. They were moving, just as we've moved from a purchase economy to a sharing economy, from a buyer entertainment and childcare to a do-it-yourself entertainment and childcare world. That in the scientific disciplines, people were immediately prepared to move from the patent is everything, ownership is everything, closed science version, which universities had becoming more implicated in over the decades, into a reflowering of the open science model, where you and I share our thoughts to everyone who's interested. Every scientist shares their research results immediately to all those who can use them. The scientific efforts to find a vaccine are pooled, not enclosed. Well, in the environmental movement, that has many parallels. So that the ability to transfer good ideas for cleaning water, for cleaning air, for putting up with it or helping to offset the costs of flooding in areas where more flooding is inevitable, building up the resilience to deal with climate events that are becoming worse. The people around the world whom I heard in those meetings, they were all energized by what they were seeing now. And they were seeing that there is the human capacity to work together in a more open, cooperative way, to say we are all in this together. We're not in it for what we can get out of it, and we're not trying to get our university better than your university. We're trying to get all of us on the same page to get more ideas, and it doesn't matter who gets the credit for the ideas. What matters is how fast we can package these ideas and get these vaccines out all over the world, and to get to look after the damage of climate change that's happening already, and to ensure that there are smart ways of making sure that climate change is stopped as easily and happily as possible. And you're finding that there are many aspects of a widely distributed world economy that use resources that needn't use. So there are a lot of people, some, buy local, produce local things are kind of wasteful because there are better ways of doing it from further away. But most of what we do now is unthinkingly using resources without actually needing them. So a lot of the people who have been growing vegetables, who hadn't grown vegetables since their grandparents' days, are now growing vegetables on their balconies, in their backyards and everywhere, and they're not going to stop. They're saying this is fun. And I've seen examples of neighborhoods together growing things and sharing things. And so a lot of these aspects of the sharing economy, which is, it doesn't produce so much GDP because most of what's produced isn't bought or sold, it's shared effort. But it produces happiness, it produces food, it produces good meals, and it connects the community. On our son's block in Vancouver, they all came out in Canada Day and stood on their own front lawns. And one of the neighbors got a trumpeter to come and play for them all. Well, that connected the community in a way that had never been connected before. In the modern fast-paced life, you hardly knew your neighbors. Now, even though they couldn't get together in the same living room, they could get together on the same street. And they tell me that it's changed the whole character of the neighborhood for the better. Well, I suspect that's happening all over the world. And that has implications not just for the neighborhoods, it easily extends to including future generations and those all over the world. And that's why among people I know who are, yes, they could say COVID is taking all the attention and air away from climate change. They say, no, it isn't. It's in fact putting us in a situation where everybody has been forced to see the advantages of planning for the future, for building protection against future disasters of all kinds, and the advantages of working together to produce happiness and long-term solutions. And so I'm optimistic about the implications for handling these longer-term problems of human cooperation.
Listening to you, it's always balancing the concept of abundance compared to scarcity. When I listen to you, it's all about everything is possible. You are always using the abundance mindset and the growth mindset, which is very much aligned to sharing economy, the gift economy, the circular economy. There are so many concepts now that are being tested in different communities that show that actually that works. So listening to you is like, okay, why don't we have more Johns around the world leading? Because if we look at just basically country leaders, it's a bunch of people. It's no more than 200 plus, right? So the role of conscious leadership, and probably this is the last question because of timing, is gonna become, is a major driver. You mentioned New Zealand, you mentioned Iceland, you mentioned countries that actually, or Scotland even, that are actually taking seriously well-being and happiness. And you see women, Finland, you see women leading those countries. I don't know if, actually I just look around and it's almost 100%, it's close to 90% women leading. Okay, is that by hazard? I mean, is that what we need? We need more women leading. What type of leaders do we need to get into eudaimonics, into capitalism, into an economy and society of happiness and well-being?
Well, you and I, Luis, are proselytizers, proponents of happiness. And you probably find, as I do, that for a mixture of reasons, women are more likely than men to think of that as a natural approach. And I'm not quite sure why that is. And it may be because, you know, there are gender differences in nurturing versus hunter-gathering, but the point is we're talking about issues that mix all aspects of life. It's probably more than coincidence that Finland, very successful in this context, Iceland, New Zealand, all have female leaders. There is another branch of work in social identity that said it was called the glass cliff, that women leaders were brought in just when the ship was sinking. And so given an impossible job. Well, if anyone thought that was true, we're now finding, of course, that the women who were actually in charge in these countries, they managed to do very well indeed. And it's stopped anyone from saying women are inferior leaders, because you couldn't have that many examples from the best in class. It may also be that they haven't come from the same backgrounds in education, of previous jobs and so on. So they're more likely to have come from the caring professions. They're more likely to have had backgrounds that, for a mixture of reasons, we need more women in leadership. That's certainly true. I mean, for example, it's true in most countries now, which have gender neutral education systems, that the universities are 60% women and 40% men. So if you think you need leaders who have high levels of education, you're going to have 2/3 of those leaders are going to be women. And so there's what used to be regarded as a problem of getting women represented in education has now changed its sign. It's of keeping men engaged in these activities and willing to participate. So the gender issues aren't over. We see this in a variety of countries in a variety of ways. But I think just as we don't want to talk about it as black versus white, rich versus poor, we don't want to talk about it as men versus women. Every gender differences we find in happiness are tiny. I mean, they slightly favor women, but it's nothing compared to the differences across the happy and less happy, capable and less happy. Essentially, the two genders are equal in terms of their capacity to do things. But we do know that things work out better when you get collaboration across genders, across races, across nationalities, across ethnicities, across religions, because the social connections you thereby get of sharing workplaces, of sharing social events, of sharing neighborhoods, lead you to get a sense of common trust and being all in this together. So you don't have to choose. You don't want to choose one ethnic group or one gender as being better or worse than the other. The point is we are all in this together, and it's the collaboration that'll allow us to make a happier future together.
Well, so let's leave it there with collaboration, with sharing, and basically the key message that I bring with me is optimism. And because we are living in a huge opportunity right now to reset, is a new renaissance. You mentioned in your article as well, from tragedy to renaissance. So let's collaborate for renaissance. And thanks to people like you, thanks to you, John Helliwell, we can really get a lot of hope. So thank you so much for this time, and I see you very soon, I hope.
And thank you for all you do to spread happiness around the world.
Thank you, John. Bye. So for everybody, it was fantastic having John, and thank you so much for the questions that we got. We'll be trying to answer them on social media, but thank you everybody for joining. So see you very soon. Bye-bye.